Hello, and welcome to A Sunny Book Nook. Today I am going to be giving you a list of book recommendations that I think everyone should read. These are all nonfiction books that have really informed my worldview, and these are books I physically own. Books that I don't physically own right now, I don't physically have with me. If I collect them later in life, or when I read them and I have a physical copy, I will do an update of this list. But this list is also encompassing of books that I have already talked about in previous videos and my previous nonfiction book recs, my socialist, leftist, theory book videos. If you want to check them out, I'm going to be talking about some of the same books. I'll link them in the cards, but I wanted to do a more holistic list now because I think at the time that I filmed those videos, I didn't have everything that I have now, and so I'm excited to bring you this recommendation list that I wish that, everyone could read, because if everyone read these, they would benefit a lot, and we would probably live in a better world. I think that if everyone had the knowledge that these books encompassed, it would just really benefit everyone, including the people who are reading them, because they really benefited me. So let's just get into it. So the first book that I really want to talk about is Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. This book is like a really, really beautiful edition. I'm kind of obsessed with it. It's like, whoa, so beautiful. This is the second hardcover edition from 2020, but the text and the book itself was released in 2013. And the the subtext, the subtitle on here is Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants. And this book just has informed so much of the way that I look at interacting with the natural world and how the natural world operates, and settler colonialism, along with sort of the way that we engage with science and knowledge, and what is considered traditional knowledge and what is considered scientific knowledge, and the way these things have really dynamic relationships with each other. It's just so beautiful. I think that because it is a mix of like memoir and more scientific ideas and like cultural theory and commentary, it is such a beautifully written and deeply impactful way of looking at the world. And I think it'll reframe the way that you think about, again, like nature and plants and animals, and also how we as people and human beings relate to each other, and the way that we consume, the way that all living things and all things on earth sort of relate to each other. I recommend this book to everyone, and everyone who has picked it up and read it that I know of has absolutely adored it and taken so much away from it. So this is definitely the first book I wanted to talk about. The next books that I want to talk about are all Angela Davis books, and she writes like really incisive short pieces, particularly Are Prisons Obsolete, which is a really short and amazing text about what prisons are and how they operate, the history of them, and why they shouldn't exist. And it takes a lot of statistics and history and numbers from the 70s and the 80s, and like looking at those particular carceral institutions and discussing the racial and gendered sort of implications and realities of incarceration. And it's very, very thoroughly researched, and Angela Davis is an incredible scholar, of course. So this is a really great one. I think if you are interested in mass incarceration and decarceration, you might be curious about the ideas of abolition and the prison industrial complex abolition, you should definitely check this book out. If you care about racial justice, you should be reading Angela Davis. If you care about economic justice and gendered oppression, you should be reading Angela Davis. And she writes very clearly and simply, and I would also recommend Freedom is a Constant Struggle for the same reason. This is sort of a collection of essays and speeches that she's given over the years, and she talks about the way that all of these systems are interconnected, and how, again, like there's a lot of material about prison abolition in here, but also imperialism and gender and history and her own experiences, as well as the construction of gender and the way that trans people are oppressed in society. There's a really good chapter in here about Obama, and she talks a lot about solidarity internationally and socialism and what that means for gender and race and all of these things. So it is a really good book, and it's short, again, really, really concise and well written, because it's mostly her spoken words and interviews and speeches. So it's things that she herself said. It's been transcribed, and because it's things that she herself like said with her own mouth and with her own words, it's like pretty rhetorical. It's pretty conversational and easy to understand. It's just very accessible, and you can also find basically every Angela Davis book for free online. So this is a great one. I would also recommend Women, Culture, and Politics, another collection of essays, very well researched and very much about like different concepts, from like minimum wage to the oppression of women in the Middle East and the way that feminist understandings of that can be imperialist. A lot of discussion about reproductive rights and sexual violence and gendered violence, and the way that she talks about and brings together a lot of ideas and history and social movements and cultural movements is phenomenal, so smart, and again, very coherent and simply communicated. I think another good introductory text to socialism, if you don't really get it really, or if you are interested in like communism and economic justice and the ideas of equality for people and economic exploitation and what that really is about, like how it operates in the world, and then how oppression looks in day-to-day lives and how it's something that we ourselves experience and see others experience. I think a really good introductory text is The Castle of Truth and Other Revolutionary Tales by Herminia Ziermühlen. This is a collection of short stories that feel very fairy tale-like, feel very fable and myth-like, but they all have a moral that enforces a socialist ideology, and they're very uplifting and sweet. There's a lot of really beautiful illustrations in here as well. It brings in a lot of simple morality of fairy tales while taking down capitalism and what it means to be in community and work together as a collective and to battle capitalism and the way that capitalism manifests in your hearts and minds and institutions and families and love. It's very beautiful and wonderful and delightful. It's a really sweet read, and it also introduces and elaborates on a lot of socialist concepts in a really, really interesting and fun way. Another book that I think is a really good Black feminist text is How We Get Free, Black Feminism in the Combahee River Collective, edited by Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor. This book encompasses the Combahee River Collective statement, which talks about identity politics and why that phrase was formed, why it was coined, and then the ways that it's been twisted and misused. And then the rest of the book is a collection of interviews from the original Combahee River Collective members. And it's, Black lesbian socialists who have really, really important ideas that were communicated in the late 20th century that are still relevant today, as we can see in the interviews conducted in, I think 2016 or something like that. It is so interesting. It tackles a lot of different angles of feminist thought and Black liberation and economic oppression and class exploitation. I think it approaches all of these things in a really interesting way and in a really, again, easily comprehensible format. And again, it's a pretty short book. You can also find the Combahee River Collective statement online for free as well. A really short read and phenomenal. I definitely talked about this book in my first leftist book recs video, and that is the autobiography of Malcolm X. This is another seminal text and looking at someone who is considered the Black radical of the 20th century. It's really important to understand, I think this book is really important if you want to understand 20th century America, period, and also the formation of Black radical politics and where it emerged, and then also Malcolm X's own experiences converting to Islam, growing up in a very tough home environment, and also the ways that he was involved in criminal life, basically in New York City, spiritual, religious, political, racial reckonings that he's had over the years, and it's a really solid read and really necessary. So yeah, the next book I want to talk about is Revolution Manifesto by the Party for Socialism and Liberation. This book is a really solid collection of essays that sort of preface State and Revolution by Lenin, which is a seminal text and like everyone needs to read it. You can find it for free on Marxist.org. But the essays prefacing this book are also really interesting because they provide a really succinct historical and cultural and socio-political context for what Lenin is saying. And me and my podcast co-host Renaissance talk about this all the time, but like Lenin, State and Revolution could have been dropped today. It would be relevant, like the political statements that he's making. And it's really important text, and it's just so important to read. It delineates a lot of basic theories while also combating against a lot of reactionary or oppositional within the socialist and leftist like sphere and thought, and sort of debunks some of that shit. He goes after the anarchists and the social democrats and the, you know, whomever in a really coherent way that is so politically relevant to the Bolshevik Party in the early 20th century when he was writing State and Revolution, but also so relevant and deeply applicable to the political climate of today. So this is another book that I think everyone needs to read. Now, another Black feminist text that I think is so important is Sister Outsider by Audre Lorde. This is a collection of essays that explores everything from the eroticism of life and feminist spaces and issues within it to motherhood, and obviously tackling capitalism, racial capitalism, and misogyny and what that looks like. And Audre Lorde is a poet first, I think, is how she describes herself. And so the writing is very poetic. That feels very memoir-like, and again, poetic, but also so historically well-researched and grounded. It connects the personal and the political, the spiritual, and the social, the politics of like living in this world, and she writes it so beautifully. You know, Black lesbian poet, mother, and socialist, just such an important essay collection. The way that she tackles like the intersectionality of oppression and within communities and different communities, the different issues that one can bring up within all of these various sort of identities and struggles and conflicts that can emerge. It's really important, a really, really necessary read for everyone, I think. A book that I read when I was younger that really helped me was Is Gender Fluid by Sally Hines. This is a really sweet, like illustrated, graphic, and short sort of interpretation and summation of a lot of like gender theory historically, and because it's so easy and really broken down in a simple way with a lot of graphics and illustrations and statistics and the idea of like what gender and what sex are and the history of that, the history of the construction of that from, you know, a social historiographical lens. It's really a good introduction to, I think, a lot of conversations about gender. It says it's a primer for the 21st century, and I think that's a pretty solid way of summarizing what this book is about, and I liked it a lot. When I was first reading this, like many years ago, it gave me a really interesting introduction and baseline for me to start exploring other ideas and learning more. And next, I want to talk about This Changes Everything by Naomi Klein, Capitalism versus the Climate. This is an incredible book about climate change and global warming and the crisis of our environment. I think that Naomi Klein, This Changes Everything, and Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass are the two books that, if you care about the earth, if you think climate change is real and something that needs to be tackled, and if you're really concerned about nature and the nature of our natural world and humanity's interaction with the natural world, these are the two books that you really need to read. And This Changes Everything sort of debunks a lot of different myths about climate change and ways of tackling climate change. It is so well researched, and, you know, Naomi Klein is a journalist, and like it really tells, and she goes into a lot of different communities and specific communities in around the world and how they've battled corporations and larger systems that, you know, decimate the earth. And she also talks about the political changes and maneuvers and implications and choices that are made that affect our world at large and the climate and how everything is connected to that and how consumption is connected to that. It's so good, and I highly, highly recommend this. The final book that I want to recommend is Fearing the Black Body, The Racial Origins of Fat Phobia by Sabrina. This is a really important book, I think, for people to read because we live in such a fat-phobic society, and I don't think that people really interrogate the origins of that, and this book does. It's a really sort of like academic text. It's chock full of citations and written as almost like an academic journal, kind of. It goes into the history of the way that women's bodies are portrayed and people's bodies in general, and particularly Black women's bodies are portrayed in art and media and medicine, and how it's been approached over the years and ways different communities and cultural perceptions of beauty influences and has created the environment that we live in today. It's a really, really important book, and I learned a lot from it. I have a few more books here to talk about. So, A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. It's a really great introduction to a socialist, feminist, non-white approach to history and the history of the United States. It really looks at the social consciousness of different periods and eras and centers the voices and experiences and histories of the people that are oftentimes not considered the movers and shakers of history. Not the founding fathers and not the Vanderbilts and, who else constructed the country, but who was the one doing the labor on the ground? Who were the indigenous people displaced during the course of the creation of certain institutions and places? Who was being hosed down and having their communities destroyed for development? And how do the suburbs operate? And what's the history of that? What happened during the Cold War and the hot spurts of it, and how was it presented in media? It's so good, and a really great basic introduction to American history in a way that takes another perspective from the dominant narrative. It's like a classic, I think, for a reason, and I really, really enjoy it. Next, I really enjoyed the essay collection Minor Feelings by Cathy Park Hong, and I think it's another book that a lot of people and everyone should read because it sort of talks about the Asian American experience, but also all the complexities that come with that and what that even means, and then also the history of Asian Americans and that stuff that isn't ever really talked about. And while interweaving it with Cathy Park Hong's own experience as being a poet and a writer and growing up in the US, navigating her own personal life throughout undergraduate school and her mental health issues. And so it's sort of it's an essay collection that looks at race and history and personal experience in a really personal and tender but intelligent way that I think is a really beneficial read and I really resonated with. And finally, I want to recommend the Women's Bible Commentary, edited by Carol Newsom. This book sort of goes into every book of the Bible, including the Apocrypha, and sort of looks at that text, the biblical text, and the history of the biblical text from a historical, political, and cultural perspective, interrogates the pre-existing sort of canonical interpretations of the text and providing a feminist approach to it. It's all written by women, all of these essays and all of these analyses, and while also providing sort of the history of what was actually happening at the time that it was written versus, or if it was based on real life events, or if the characters in the Bible are what degree of reality was it removed from, and why? What did this story have emerged from the place that it was? What did these characters and their actions in the Bible itself mean about this religion at large and what it means for people today? I think because Christianity has such a dominant cultural hegemonic grasp on society, and because so many people interpret it in a really shallow seeming way and in a way that doesn't really, it just feels so unintelligent, unprocessed. It feels very surface level. I think this book is a really great introduction to looking at that shit from a more critical lens, and it was really interesting to read. And maybe not everyone should read this book, but if you're interested in Jewish and Christian history and theology, this is a really interesting book to check out, I think. So those are all the books that are nonfiction books that I own that I think everyone should read. I really, really hope that this was interesting for you. And I obviously, like, there's so many books that I don't physically own that I think could go on this list and would probably, if I had to like narrow down the list of books that I would, in my imaginary world, sort of project into the minds of everyone so they could all read, some of the books that I present on this list wouldn't be on it in favor of other books that are not on this list currently because I don't physically own them. So there's that, but you know, if you want me to make like a part 2 to this video or just a part 3 to my nonfiction recommendation series, because there's part 1, part 2, and I've read more since then that I think I could continue adding and that are not repeats of things that I've talked about in this video, please let me know if you've read any nonfiction that you think fits within this list or this category of things and topics that I'm trying to explore and encourage others to explore. Please leave them down in the comments, or you know, if any of these books are ones that interest you, let me know and like why. Thank you so much for watching. Like and subscribe if you haven't already. You can find me on all of my social medias, linked down below as always. My podcast is always linked down below. So that's all I have for you today, and bye.